went to lunch with him. Great to see you. So anyway, the major thing I wanted to say about that was that we knew we were doing the Tchaikovsky piano concerto. We knew we were doing this Beethoven First Symphony, in which he asserts himself as this composer who's really trying to make his mark. We didn't know what the third piece on the program was going to be because it hadn't been written yet. We co-commissioned a piece of music by Christopher Theophanidis, wonderful obviously living composer whose music we've played before. We played a piece of his several years ago called Rainbow Body, which is really evocative and wonderful. And so we asked him to write something that we thought would work well on this program. I can't say that we were the only ones who asked. We're part of about it was a co-commission of maybe 25 orchestras together. It's a consortium that funded this. And the piece that he came up with absolutely does not fit with this program. It's the last thing in the world I ever would have programmed with this music. I'm just telling you this honestly. But it's a good piece, and I'm glad we're doing it. It's very exciting to participate in the creation of new art and to be sort of the midwives who help make this happen. That's awesome. So I'm thrilled that we're doing it. But it has no relationship whatsoever. I can't find one, maybe Conrad can, with Beethoven and Tchaikovsky. It's a piece called Dreamtime Ancestors about Aboriginal Australian spirits. So that's cool. It's very accessible. It's 3 movements long. And from the beginning, you get a sound that is sort of declamatory, like there's going to be some kind of spiritual thing happening. Do you happen to have that available to you? Yes. All right, let's play the beginning of Dreamtime Ancestors, just so you hear. Where one instrument or group of instruments, like the first violins, will play, let's say, a rising melody. And as they play the melody, other instruments of the orchestra, other sections of the orchestra, grab onto each note that the first violin is playing on the way up. So that the first violin might be going dee-da-dee, but then someone's holding on to the ba, someone's holding on to the ba, someone's holding on to the dee. So it sounds like you're in a cathedral or something. Just by virtue of how it's orchestrated, everything gets incredible resonance and reverb. I think it's a pretty cool technique. Let's play the beginning of the second movement. Okay. Symphony, and that's what you were listening to just now. They did a really good job of it too. Beethoven First Symphony, have you got that ready? I just want you to hear the opening 4 measures of Beethoven first and just realize how strange it is. Let me play something in the piano. Hold on a second. If you hear the C major chord here, it feels pretty settled, right? But if you add the seventh to it, or maybe if you put it here, it has to go somewhere, right? It doesn't feel settled. It has to go to there. But that's not the harmony of the major. In other words, the C major at the beginning, it's in the key of C, but that C immediately goes to a different key by the second note. Let's go ahead and play that. That's all, thank you. It does that several more times. So I just wanted to point that out. I will probably have the orchestra demonstrate that because I think it's such an amazing thing for someone in their very first symphony to do. All right? And let's not talk about Beethoven anymore right now. Let's get the Tchaikovsky soloist here.
Although before we go into to Tchaikovsky, I just wanted to mention I'm not sure this. If you look at my bio, it will probably, I think it's in there, but I don't know if all of you knew. Like, I've worked with Chris Theophanidis for many years as a composer, so this is a fun little happenstance that we're on the same program.
There's a connection, yeah.
So there's like a connection at that level, if not necessarily at the musical or programmatic level. But yeah, I've worked with Chris. I actually started working with Chris in 2003, and he was still teaching orchestration at Juilliard at the time. And Rainbow Body I don't think he had yet won the Master Prize for Rainbow Body. I believe that was sort of one of the first things that really shot him out into really big, especially national acclaim. And it's one of the best things about starting young-ish in the business is getting to see people really just become recognized and successful, and that's been really lovely to see with him. And it's really funny to me because I've been hearing his music and talking to him about his music for years and years, and I was listening to that second movement excerpt, and I'm just like, yeah, that's Chris. That is so, he has such a style and that kind of acoustical echo chamber effect. So, anyway, I just wanted to mention that if you needed a thread, there may be one there.
Thank you so much. That's really great. I should have asked you about that last night. So, I thought maybe, Conrad, before we start talking about Tchaikovsky itself, people would be very interested in knowing a little bit about how you got so successful so quickly in this business and what your journey has been like in music.
That's a tricky question because I don't know if I have ever felt at any one moment like I was successful. I think, weirdly enough, the answer to that question might be that I have not felt successful, or one of the reasons I've been able to do what I do, and I think do it fairly consistently over the years, and just kind of, at this point, I really have just been chugging away at it for about 8 years, probably, of really consistent work. I signed to management when I was 12, and I'm 21 now, so there's been around that amount of time. And I think that part of it is just really hunkering down and just doing the work and focusing on that and prioritizing the kind of nitty-gritty of the work, the rehearsal process and all of that, and not prioritizing sort of the more nebulous signifiers of success, like critical acclaim or playing with XYZ orchestra or XYZ conductor at a certain time, by a certain time. I've never been a kind of goal setter type in that way. It's been always more about just really enjoying working with people and figuring out how to best work with people and just connecting with people more than connecting with some vague idea that I have in my head of what successful looks like. But I started playing the piano on my own when I was about 18 months old. where I think I started out just plunking stuff out and plonking away at the piano like I think every baby does. I mean, I think that pianos are actually great toys for babies because they're responsive, they are creative and generative and open-ended, and so they're great tools and great canvases for very young people to explore on. And I think we had an old upright Baldwin in our house because my older sister, 5 years my senior, was taking lessons at the time. And I'm plonking away randomly, and then slowly it starts to take shape into Mary Had a Little Lamb, I believe is the first one. Because I was growing up hearing nursery tunes, I had like an old cassette and boombox, which makes me very old. I had like an old cassette and boombox of nursery tunes playing in my room a lot of the time. And so it was like picking apart the melody. And it's really funny to watch the old VHS tapes, because I don't remember any of this obviously, but if I play a wrong note, I go back to the beginning of the melody and start over again until I can play the whole thing through, which is roughly the same level of discipline I have today. And it's so that was my early start, very auspicious beginnings. But I didn't start studying the piano until maybe when I was 3 and a half. I started violin lessons first, actually, because unlike pianos, violins come in extra small sizes. And I don't know, it really kind of snowballed from there. It's funny to look back on because I'm realizing how much happened in a fairly short amount of time. But of course, at the time, when you're 7, 8 years old, 3 years feels like an eternity. I studied. I moved with my family. I was born in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, and we moved a little closer to Chicago when I was about 5, and that was so that I could, have access to slightly more serious music education. But it was still a community music school, and it was a really high-quality music education, but it was still a community music school that just served all people at all skill levels. And those early years just formed me so thoroughly, and it's very, very funny to look back and realize that was only 4 years. 4 years ago now, getting older means that the months feel like years and the years feel like months. That's all I will say. But yeah, so I started really young, and then it just really felt like it snowballed organically into what we might call some approximation of a career. And now I just kind of do it, and it's always a process. I guess it was never a moment of clarity where it was like, this is what I do, this is how I do it, this is what I want to do. I think it's been for me more of just constantly trying to ask a lot of questions, and a process of constantly questioning myself and my intentions, and just sort of just asking myself to think a little harder about what I'm doing, and to avoid a certain ease or complacency in terms of what my goals are, or what and I'm talking about larger goals here, larger kind of loftier immaterial goals, just what my ideas are, and I think that that's been useful.
That's not usual, though. That's not what you usually find with soloists, especially soloists who are traveling around a lot. They're playing 1 week after the next in another place. For example, we were in Cincinnati last week doing a Rachmaninoff Rhapsody with Paganini. So, that is what a lot of soloists do. They'll go from one city to the next playing a different concerto in a different place. And to maintain that thoughtfulness and that lack of complacency and that feeling that, I have not arrived, but we're always still becoming. There's always something I can learn. That's great. I hope you always have that.
I hope so too. Well, no, I hope so too. Also, just because, and I think for the time being, I think that will be the case. Just because I imagine, like hypothetically, I imagine feeling like I have figured everything out. I've arrived, and that seems really boring. That seems really, really unappealing. That like actually that makes me feel itchy and uncomfortable to imagine that.
Let's talk about Tchaikovsky, because in that context this really makes sense. When Tchaikovsky wrote his first piano concerto, he was teaching at the Moscow Conservatory where he had been asked to. His boss was Nikolai Rubinstein, great pianist, brother of Anton Rubinstein, who had run the St. Petersburg Conservatory where Tchaikovsky himself went. So Tchaikovsky was not only a composer, he was a teacher of harmony, I suppose a teacher of piano as well, and very much in the shadow of this Nikolai Rubinstein. So when he wrote his first piano concerto, he wanted to dedicate it to him, and in fact he asked him for some advice. And there's a great diary entry that Tchaikovsky wrote where he said, I played the first movement for Nikolai Rubinstein. He didn't say a word, he was silent. So I kept playing. I played my second movement, still not a word. I played the third movement. Again, there was not a word, but it looked like he was ready to say something. And it was like he started to swell up in anger and said, this whole concerto was a piece of trash. It did not fit together. It had no coherence at all. Now and then I had stolen melodies from other people. It needed to be completely reworked. And if I completely reworked it, maybe he would consider performing it. And Tchaikovsky's answer was, I will not change a single note. And he ran out of the room. Tchaikovsky was notoriously insecure in so many ways, but as a composer, especially as a young composer, he didn't yet know who he was going to become, the icon he was going to become. And so this shook him greatly, even though he really didn't. I think there were a couple of revisions that happened, but nothing major after that. So there are many ways you could approach this concerto, and I'm just curious, Conrad, how are you approaching it?
Well, it's funny that you talk about that because I think that one of the... I've had an evolving relationship with this piece too. I mean, this piece is now such a staple of the repertoire. Certainly it's like kind of has a stronghold on conservatories, it feels sometimes. Because you roam the halls of Juilliard's fourth floor, which is where all our practice rooms are, and you'll probably hear it on one day of the week at least. And I remember when I first learned the piece several years ago, the first time I ever played it, I think I struggled with it because of all of the tropes that surrounded the piece in my imagination and in my sort of conception of how the piece worked. It was always linked to this big presentational virtuosity. We have this iconic opening with this orchestral melody and these huge piano chords, and I was always accustomed to just hearing that as these big columns of sound. And
maybe you can show us.
Oh yeah, sure. You might recognize it. We have an orchestral opening. That's my entrance, and that goes on for a bit, and then the orchestra has its big sweeping melody, this very, very well known, very well loved, and all of that. And I think a lot of my journey with the piece has been trying to let go of the legacy of the piece, I suppose, which is a difficult thing to do if you grow up surrounded by the conservatory environment, because it can be hard to just shed some of the stuff that you've inadvertently inherited just by virtue of hearing it all the time. And a lot of my relationship with the piece has involved me growing to understand or accept the way the piece is structured. I mean, it's funny that you talk about how some of the early comments were that it didn't cohere. Because I think you could still, if you wanted to make that intellectual argument today, that it's a really free-form work in a lot of ways. The first movement especially, which is 20 to 25 minutes long, depending on how one plays it, usually, and it floats around a lot in terms of how it treats its material. We have an opening, that opening section, that melody doesn't really come back in particularly full form ever again, really, beyond the first 3 or 4 minutes. which is kind of still, I think still not exactly encouraged by composition and structure. You know, it does break rules of what we expect from our big constructed works. You know, it doesn't feel composed, right? It feels like it's taking up too much space. It feels indulgent. It feels like too much. And for me, a lot of how I learned to understand the piece was embracing that. Was embracing this sort of sense of it almost being too big for the confines of the form. You know, it's just spilling out. And at least for the first movement. In the other movements, my conception shifts a little bit. But in the first movement, it's really, for me, it just feels like this constant bubbling over with ideas. But then so there's that structural thing. There's that, my journey with the structural aspect of the piece. And then there's the pianistic stuff. And as I said, I've always, you know, when I was very, very young, first hearing the piece, I was always just thinking, oh, it's this huge, virtuosic showpiece type thing. It's the kind of piece that makes people shoot up onto their feet and, you know, all of that stuff. It's all about that. It's all about this very presentational, look at me, look at what I can do. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I mean, for example, I was doing the Emperor Concerto earlier this month, although no, now it's March, isn't it? So last month, whatever. Again, the months feel like years. And I was doing Beethoven 5 earlier, and my approach with that piece is to actually get into character, to sort of think, you know, who is the character who plays this piece and likes this piece, and, you know, because I feel like the Beethoven 5 is a piece about virtuosity, which isn't the same thing as saying it's a virtuosic piece, but it is a piece about virtuosity. So for me, you know, that's a piece where I get into a character who is invested in the tropes of virtuosity, who really gets a lot of satisfaction out of that, and that's my way of getting into the headspace of that piece. But for this piece, I don't know. I mean, for me, I don't know if that quite works, because a lot of this piece is actually very melodic, almost kind of melodic with some, like, in an unadorned way. For example, the second theme of the first movement, it's first introduced by the winds, and I pick it up, and when I pick it up, it's really, really quite almost sparse, relatively speaking. Yeah. This is your performance right here. So it goes like that, and hi everybody. So it proceeds like that there's a lot of writing like that. There's a lot of kind of quiet, unadorned, relatively light writing in the piano, just sonically, and
There's a question related to that.
yes.
So, I think where you're going with this is that what sounds virtuosic sometimes is just coming out of, it's sort of spilling over from that intimacy, maybe.
That wasn't exactly where I was going with this, but I think there's something there. Really what I'm getting at is actually the fact that the big virtuosic moments that do definitely appear, you know, just like cascades of passage or huge octave passages, even those opening chords.
And that third movement could end up.
Exactly. There is so much stuff that's impressive and pyrotechnic in the pianistic writing, but the piece is also so long, and I feel like the bulk of the piece actually isn't about those moments. Those moments are these climaxes or these bursts of energy, but I think it's kind of dangerous to think of that as what the piece is about. And for me, the piece is about something much more complicated, something more tender, something more subtle, something more flamboyant, something more fey. All of these other emotional tenors, all of these other affective realms, which are, I think, more challenging actually than virtuosity from an audience standpoint. I think it demands a little bit more from the listener and from the musician, just because it's a little bit more interior. I think that's where I'm really going with this, is that although this piece has these huge moments of look at me-ism, you heard it here first, there's a lot of it that I think is introspective. And that's just been my relationship to the piece, and so that's definitely present in how I play the first one. I mean, and I guess what ends up happening then is to loop back to what you mentioned in terms of the virtuosity that comes out of intimacy. It's not quite that so much as it's almost just flip that around, and it's about then I can approach the virtuosity with some measure of emotional intimacy. And you can start to treat the virtuosic elements as incidental to the sort of emotional intensity, and as incidental to the turmoil that might have built up.
And then there's times when both are happening at once. For example, the melody you just played is played in the woodwinds or in the orchestra, let's say, equally intimately, but at the same time, then you've got virtuosic passages in and around it.
Right, I mean, there's, as I said, you have that melody, so after I have that solo, quiet, sparse, almost choral statement of the theme, then it's picked up by, what is it, the winds that time? It's picked up by the oboe, and then in the midst of all that, I'm doing a bunch of filigree. These almost harp-like gossamer textures, and that's a very different sound world, I think, than just pianistic showiness, I suppose.
And our goal when we put all this together with the orchestra is to have both be equally present. In other words, that the melody being played in the oboe can be heard clearly, which is sometimes difficult because the oboe is behind the piano, quite a bit behind the piano. And the quiet sort of blanket of accompaniment in the strings that are just very lush but quietly supporting what's going on. And at the same time, the filigree, along with the melody that you also heard, which was present throughout, can be heard equally well. So that's a very practical goal when we're putting something like this together. In the first rehearsal that we had yesterday, it was canceled, so I don't know what happened.
I was wondering where you were going to go with that.
I'm thinking we maybe should go to questions, because we don't have that much time left. I thought you might have some questions for Conrad, and or for me, but I'm personally very interested in what Conrad has to say. Any questions? And if you don't have some, I will. Okay, here we go.
Oh yes, we have a microphone coming around.
Conrad, one of the things as you're talking, you're going to be on the stage for a long time. What kind of things go through your mind during your performance? Are you thinking, I hope Scott does it like I want him to? Or maybe I'll take this next move a little differently? What are you thinking about?
Well, it's funny, we talked about this a little bit last night, and I think I'm actually I used to say that I'm not really thinking at all on stage, that I'm not thinking actively, and I think really that just means that I'm not necessarily thinking hyperverbally. But there is a lot of intention when I'm on stage, but it can be a complicated process. A lot of the time I feel like when I'm on stage, I'm trying to actively play in as unvarnishedly myself a way as possible. Which is to say that I think it's easy sometimes as a pianist, especially when we're playing standard repertoire, to even inadvertently fall into patterns where we're kind of just playing not on autopilot directly, but sort of just in a way that aligns with maybe how we think something should sound or should be interpretively. And I feel like that's what practice is for. I feel like practice is that space where you try out your ideas and you organize your ideas and you sort of figure out what your approach is, what your perspective to something is. And then performance is where you execute and you also respond to what's happening. I mean, performance is a funny little thing, right? Because of that, you're especially because it's not like we're actually improvising, right? We are going on off text, basically. But there has to be this allowance of spontaneity and what have you. And I think for me, one of the ways of doing that is just to kind of remind myself, like, just be present, just make your choices in the moment. I guess that's sort of what I find myself saying in my head. Sort of just be present so that you can react to things instead of feeling like you have to now follow a template. Something I like to say is that I think rehearsal and practice, rehearsal especially actually, is about establishing as solid a bedrock as possible and planting really solid and fertile soil so that in performance, spontaneity can grow out of that soil. So that, in performance, lots of unexpected things can grow with some solid underpinnings. And that's sort of, that guides what I'm thinking about on stage.
I think ideally that would go for any kind of performance. I'm sure Carla there in the back would agree that as an actor, that's what you're trying to do as well, right? You memorize your lines, you learn the ensemble as well as you can so that when it actually happens, you almost forget that this text already existed and the text comes out, but it comes out as if it's being created in the moment. That's a wonderful ideal to have as a performer, as a conductor, as a solo musician, as an actor, really any kind of performer.
I think we should say that it's not always 100% successful, but just because it's hard to. I mean, it's important to acknowledge that. It's something that's just very challenging to reach that ideal, but it's the goal. That's what you're challenging yourself to do.
Other questions? Yes.
When you relocated from Urbana-Champaign out loud to the Chicago metropolitan area, how did you pursue your musical education?
So the question was, when I relocated from Urbana-Champaign to the Chicago metro area, I lived in a suburb of Chicago called Naperville, which is a quintessential Illinois suburb name. How did I pursue my musical education? That was really my parents doing. I was really fortunate. My parents, I think, made very healthy and thoughtful decisions when I was very young. I mean, it was really their choice and their decision to move the whole family so that I could maybe just have access. I think it was based on a recommendation from my sister's piano teacher, actually, that there was this music school, this community music school in Winnetka, Illinois, called the Music Institute of Chicago, and that there was a really wonderful teacher there named Emilio Del Rosario, or Mr. D, as he was colloquially known. And so it was, I'll take this opportunity to say that my parents, throughout my early childhood especially, did something that I've tried to really absorb as a life lesson. Because neither of my parents are musical. They come, my mother's a scientist, my father's an engineer. They come from kind of that's their background. Not really artistically inclined, or at least not outwardly so. So when I started doing whatever it was that I was doing, they asked asked for help. They asked people who they thought would know more than they did for assistance, for ideas, for help. I have really tried to absorb that as the lesson that it can be, which is, there is absolutely no shame ever in asking someone who is more informed than you about something for suggestions. I think my parents could have made a lot of terrible decisions on my behalf, and because they tried to ask as many sources as possible for different ideas, they made a lot of good choices. So I try to kind of give big ups to my parents whenever I get a chance. So
that's great. And one more question. Yes.
And I was just going to kind of follow up on the individual experience kind of thing, and where you're coming from. What's your goal? How do you see your future unfolding? We have a friend whose son is a wonderful pianist, and he's working on a cruise ship. There's lots of competition, and I'm just wondering what you see. You're obviously composed, and what do you think that you're going to be doing in the future?
I've never been very good at 5-year plans or anything like that. I can't think that way. It makes me anxious, and I feel like it always makes me feel like I'm prioritizing the wrong things. Really, if I have any loftier goal for what I do, it's to keep working and to kind of keep being involved in some process of critical inquiry into what I'm doing. Which is to say that I want to be continuing to play concerts while also sort of questioning the assumptions of the concert hall, or questioning the assumptions about even a piece. I mean, talking about the Tchaikovsky even, I think I have this impulse right now, at least, and I have for a couple of years now, where it's the impulse is really just to think, what else can we do with a given text, with a given context, with a given piece? What else is there? What's not being explored necessarily? And it doesn't even have to be in the larger context of the industry or anything like that. It can just be within my own brain. What am I not thinking enough about? I think my goal is to maintain that part of my thought process, and to not let that be compromised by the sort of everyday reality of just having to kind of hustle and work and get paid and all of that stuff. And because that is an interesting thing. I mean, we're all freelancers at the end of the day, so tax season is a nightmare. There's all this day-to-day stuff which seems like it just occupies all of your time. But I think there has to be something else. There has to be this drive to explore, this kind of incessant curiosity. I think that's what I'm always thinking of maintaining. So my hope is that whatever I happen to be doing in 5 years, in 10 years, that it's still that's the engine still driving it, is a sense of curiosity, a sense of exploration, and a sense of critical thinking, I suppose.
One more question. We can't not take on this question.
So the question is, do I compose? So the answer is yes. I write, I compose. I do a decent amount of composing. Right now I'm actually doing mostly orchestral composing. In the last couple of years, I've done a lot of orchestral work. If you told me that I was going to be primarily doing orchestral work 4 years ago, I would not have believed you. It just has been what the work has been. I feel obscenely fortunate in that regard. I write, I compose. Composing is really interesting because I think a lot of the time it's really just like banging your head against a wall every single day and hoping that the blood is productive. And it really sometimes just feels like you're hacking away. And then sometimes you will just have an idea and you will miraculously be able to execute it to some sort of full completion. And that is just the most gratifying feeling in the world. But a lot of the time it's hard. It's hard. And I wish that more people explicitly talked about it, because when I talk to composers, we're always bonding over how hard it is. And I still feel like there's this mythology sometimes around like some divine inspiration, and it just doesn't track with how it feels and what like my conversations with other composers are like. I mean, but I do compose a lot and I love it. I think it has had like an immeasurable impact on how I play and how I conceive my work as a performer. So
one of the greatest things I think, for all performers is if you can approach your work like a composer. If you can ask yourself, why did I make this decision? Imagine you're the composer, and then I wrote this. Why did I write this? And that really, as you said, it informs how you perform it. You'll have a lot more chance to see Conrad. There's something.
I have a question.
Yes.
Conrad, you're going to be, of course, doing also a program here at the Block on Saturday night. And we just posted a video on our Facebook page that you made that was an introduction to your new album, Pictures.
Oh,
and it's
okay.
very closely related, I think, to some of the repertoire you're going to be playing.
Yes.
It would be, I think, interesting for our audience to hear about that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm not sure if I was discussing this a little bit earlier. I'm not sure if there's going to be a printed program. I hope there will be. But I'm going to be playing a program on Saturday here, and my most recent album was Pictures. It's called Pictures. It was released last fall on Morgan Classics. It is available on Amazon, on iTunes, on Apple Music, on Spotify. Occasionally I'm good at showing product.
We'll have a video too, so.
Oh, yeah, you can buy it at the concert.
Yeah.
Please do. It contributes to chart sales. Anyway. So I released an album last year, and it ended up comprising pictures at an exhibition and a bunch of more contemporary works, one of which was my own, which I'm not playing on Saturday. I know I should, but I'm not performing that piece on Saturday. But Pictures is basically an album about memory and images, because Pictures at an exhibition, which I am playing on Saturday, Pictures at an exhibition for me is a piece, as much as it's a gallery tour, for me it's really a piece about grief and a piece about processing grief. For me it's like a way of memorializing a person through their work, and in the process of that memorialization also dealing with your grief and working through your grief by going through someone's work and considering someone's work. And so a lot of the pieces I'll be playing on Saturday, as well as a lot of the pieces on my album, consider memory in some form. Sometimes more directly and sometimes a little bit more obliquely. And a lot of also, this is a little more relevant to the program on Saturday than to the album. A lot of what I like to do in a recital format is to really kind of take advantage of the setting, of just having people at your show. I mean, what I love about live performance in general is that there is this element of a captive audience. You are that captive audience. I like that. I think that there's a lot of interesting potential there. So what I like to do in sort of solo performance settings is, shape programs where I kind of can control the response a little bit to the degree that that's possible. So I like stringing pieces together without really room for applause necessarily, and sort of creating these juxtapositions between pieces. So on Saturday's program, we'll have Bach alongside Elliot Carter, we'll have Rachmaninoff alongside David Lang and Joy Wolf, stuff like that. And the hope is that juxtaposition can allow us to hear everything a little bit differently, that it can generate some sort of sonic or interpretive or listening possibility that might not have been as evident otherwise. And I will say I actually tend to like the idea of juxtaposition a little bit more than the idea of fusion, because I feel like when I think of juxtaposition, I also think of friction, and when I think of friction, I think of fire and combustion and a spark. And that's generally what's more interesting to me, sort of what happens when you have that tension and what happens when you rub hard enough. there's a kind of an unpredictable potential there. And so I think that that's what I'm usually trying to achieve, whether successfully or not, with my recital performances, all of them, including the one on Saturday. So please come.
I think it goes without saying that everyone here is going to come to that, as well as to Friday evening's performance of the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto and Beethoven's First Symphony, and the new piece, which nobody in West Michigan has ever heard before, Christopher Theophanidis' Dreamtime Ancestors. Thank you so much to Conrad Tao.